So this video is a bit different from what I usually make. This video is an opinion piece and can get spicy at times. So if this isn't your jam, I'd recommend watching one of my other videos. If you've been around transit YouTube or other media platforms, you're probably familiar with the rail versus bus debate. These videos usually boil down to trains being better than buses because of factors such as efficiency, permanence, development, and other similar arguments. Therefore, the argument goes, if we want good transit, the solution is building streetcar and light rail lines instead of buses and BRT. However, as I became more involved in transit advocacy in St. Louis and Cleveland, I realized that many of these rail versus bus arguments really weren't that important and were not good reasons for choosing rail over bus. Ultimately, I believe choosing rail versus bus for your transit line should primarily depend on one factor: capacity. Here's why. One common argument for rail is that rail vehicles are more efficient and can therefore save a transit agency money, from less energy loss while in motion to longer-lasting vehicles that cost less to maintain per year. As a result, even though the upfront cost to build rail is higher than running bus service, the money saved from greater efficiency almost always justify building rail. Now, I don't disagree that rail can be more efficient. However, the efficient option is not always the option that will save you the most money. Imagine you're hosting a dinner party and need to buy 24 eggs. The cost of the 24 pack of eggs is higher than the 12 pack of eggs, but the cost of each egg in the 24 pack is lower. In other words, the 24 pack is more efficient. So if you need 24 eggs, you will save more money buying the 24 pack instead of two separate 12 packs. However, let's say you only need 12 eggs because the eggs are only for yourself. In this situation, buying the 24 pack will mean you are spending more money just for 12 eggs to rot away in your fridge. In the same way, if you barely have the ridership to justify a 40-foot bus coming every half hour, spending significantly more money to build rail on that same corridor with the same service makes little financial sense. Indeed, this is what the research shows. Researchers from the University of Austin analyzed operating costs between bus and heavy rail in the United States over a 10-year period. There was a threshold of 84 passengers per vehicle at which heavy rail will cost less than a bus. Now, it's likely that this threshold will vary a lot for each transit line due to the route and service differences and associated costs. However, this study still shows that although rail can be more efficient, a transit agency can only save money through those efficiencies if there is high enough ridership to justify the higher capacities of rail. Now, some might point out that rail vehicles last longer than buses, meaning a transit agency will need to replace rail vehicles and infrastructure less regularly than for buses. However, this is just not that big of a problem for many transit agencies. Even though buses don't last as long, they are still cheaper to replace, with a 60-foot articulated bus costing around $1.3 million, as opposed to anywhere between $5 to $8 million for a light rail vehicle. In fact, transit agencies such as the Cleveland RTA usually don't find it especially challenging to replace their bus fleet. In contrast, the RTA has found it incredibly challenging to find funding to replace its aging rail vehicles, which are decades past their useful life. It's gotten so bad that old rail vehicles spontaneously catch fire, and the RTA has resorted to cannibalizing existing vehicles for replacement parts. Moreover, even though rail infrastructure may last longer, rail is significantly more sensitive to maintenance problems than bus infrastructure. Despite having sections built as recently as 2006, the Metrolink in St. Louis frequently sees service reductions for minor maintenance problems, and the aging rail lines in Cleveland also see similar service reductions.
There's a train in front of me that's down, and it will be moving shortly. Again, RCA do apologize. I have to have everyone.
Too hot outside so your wires begin to sag?
The high heat shutting down the line on Sunday and today during morning and afternoon rush hour.
Too cold outside so your track shifts a few millimeters?
Blue Line Metrolink trains will only run between the Shrewsbury, Lansdowne, and Forest Park stations. Metro says that's in place as a safety precaution due to excessive ice and snow near an area of the tracks.
Vehicle broken down on the tracks?
Riders trapped on the RTA Green Line for more than an hour Tuesday in a potentially dangerous area outside Tower City.
Need to fix a section of track? Meanwhile, even though bus infrastructure may not last as long, a bus can still run on roads that are riddled with potholes and deviate around broken vehicles. Since being built in 2008, the Health Line in Cleveland has practically seen no service reductions due to maintenance issues. In fact, during East Side rail shutdowns, the RTA often advises riders to use the Health Line instead. Another common argument for rail is that rails are more permanent. Meanwhile, buses are here today, gone tomorrow. Therefore, rail is more likely to produce rider confidence and increase ridership while stimulating development. Well, is this true? Let's take a look at the Loop Trolley in St. Louis. Built in 2018, this streetcar originally promised to provide frequent service and stimulate development along a busy commercial corridor in the city. However, due to vehicle delays and reduced service, the Loop Trolley saw significantly lower ridership and fare revenue than was projected. As a result,
this weekend, after just more than 1 year in operation, the Del Mar Loop Trolley will shut down.
it was not until nearly 3 years later that the trolley was forced back into operating, as not doing so would require repaying millions of dollars back to the federal government. And today, the trolley only runs every hour in the afternoon, only on Thursdays through Sundays, and only from May through October. In other words, this route is effectively abandoned most of the year. The St. Louis Metrolink is not immune from this either. In 2006, the Red Line had 6 trains per hour. Today, that's down to 3. What about buses? In Cleveland, high ridership core bus routes such as the 26 Detroit, 22 Lorraine, or 6 Euclid have existed for more than a century, with no sign of being eliminated. In fact, these routes have recently seen more frequent service after the 2021 network redesign, and RTA's long-range plan specifically outlines these routes for increased service and infrastructure improvements. Therefore, while steel rails themselves might be permanent, they do not guarantee the permanence of the train running on them any more than a paved road guarantees the permanence of a bus running on them. Rather, it's not rail that makes a line permanent, it's high ridership. And I think this might explain why many associate rail with permanence, because when rail is done right, it's built along a line with high ridership. So the causal relationship is actually the opposite. Rail doesn't create permanence, ridership creates permanence. Yet another argument for why rail is better than buses is that rails can spur development while buses cannot. However, is this actually true? If you take a look at the development along St. Louis and Cleveland's rail lines, you'll see that despite some lines having existed for more than 50 years, there's very little development along them. Instead, most station areas are parking lots within industrial zones. A few exceptions, such as the Van Aken district, exist, but these developments required an active effort by the city and the RTA to intentionally attract development through land use changes and tax incentives. Meanwhile, the Healthline BRT has spurred around $9.5 billion of development down the length of the route on Euclid Avenue. Similarly, many of the development projects on the west side of Cleveland follow the 26 Detroit and 22 Lorraine, both of which are local bus routes. Why is that? Am I really trying to say that buses are better at spurring development than rail? No. The reason why development does not occur near rail stations as often is because the rail lines use old freight rail right-of-way. As a result, the land around stations are often zoned for low-density industrial uses and are in relatively weak housing markets. In contrast, many of the high-frequency bus routes serve traditionally dense residential and commercial development, and Cleveland's recently passed legislation will allow transit-oriented development along high-frequency routes. Ultimately, whether or not a transit vehicle runs on steel wheels or rubber tires plays a much smaller, insignificant role. If your goal is to spur development, your focus should primarily be on land use policies and the local housing market, not what kind of wheel the transit vehicle outside uses. At this point, you might say, what about the environmental impacts of buses, their ride quality, acceleration, among other arguments? Well, there are a lot more arguments that I'm not going to cover because this video would never end otherwise, and ultimately, it would be pointless because the answer would be the same. Is rail better than bus, or are buses better than rail? I would say neither, because this is the wrong question to be asking. The rail versus bus debate reminds me a lot about misconceptions related to evolution. I remember watching the History Channel and seeing someone try to disprove evolution by saying, if humans evolved naturally, how come we still have trees? Why haven't trees evolved intelligence and become like humans? This statement assumes that humans are more evolved or better than trees, which is not true. You might be tempted to say, of course humans are better. Humans are more intelligent and we can more drastically change our built environment. However, a tree would argue that it's more evolved than humans because it can survive harsh winters outside without needing shelter or clothing. Trees can also just live off of sunlight, whereas we need to go through the effort to hunt our food. Both humans and trees have their strengths and weaknesses that you could argue about ad nauseum. However, from a biological perspective, no species is better or more evolved than the other. And as a corollary, it's also incorrect to state that all species will or must evolve directionally up a hierarchy to become intelligent like humans. The only thing that matters is whether or not a species is adapted to survive in its environment. And I think we need to take the same approach to transit technology. If I covered every argument in favor or against rail versus bus, this video would never end and it would be really unproductive. I believe that we should therefore avoid applying value statements to transit modes, and avoid implying that the ultimate form of transit is, say, a train, or that buses are a lesser form of transit or aren't even real transit to begin with. Instead, we should be asking if rail is adapted to or makes sense for a specific corridor and service compared to buses, given factors such as expected ridership, what infrastructure already exists, and other needs within the transit system. Is your transit line in a city like Toronto where packed articulated buses are coming every 5 minutes? Yeah, you should probably spend money towards increasing capacity and convert that to a streetcar or light rail. Is your transit line in a Rust Belt city where ridership has been falling while most buses are coming only every 15 to 30 minutes and rarely fill up? It's probably better to prioritize that money towards improving frequency instead of converting it to rail. This is why I find it so frustrating whenever someone comments that a bus line, quote, should have been rail, not because of ridership, but because of a lack of signal priority or nice waiting environments, or something else that can be solved more easily without needing to build rail. It creates the impression that the only way to improve buses is to convert it to rail, which is much more expensive to build and takes significantly more time, meaning you end up with much less of it. In other words, this creates an all or nothing situation, implying most buses and bus riders who don't make the cut for rail don't deserve better service or amenities, which I think is a bad position to have if the goal is better transit for more people. And I'm not saying this because I hate trains. Trains are really cool, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who would agree. However, choosing transit mode should not be on the basis of how cool it is. I know plenty of people who believe cars are cool, but I highly doubt that the reason so many of us drive is because we all really like cars. Instead, we drive because it's or sometimes the, only practical option. I feel the same can be said about transit. If you're a transit enthusiast or transit tourist, you might decide to use transit based on whether or not the infrastructure is cool or unique. However, for most other people, I suspect their decision to regularly use transit is based on whether or not it gets them to where they need to go in a reasonable amount of time and for a reasonable cost. In other words, service. This also ties into my opinion that among online transit and urbanism communities, we focus a little too much on transit technology. And I'm guilty of this too, because it's easy to show you, the viewer, a video or photo of a cool train and station and go, this transit system is good because look at this infrastructure. On the other hand, how are you supposed to communicate and compare service? Stare at a frequency map and list service bands? Have the viewer compare schedules flashed across the screen? It's a concept that you just cannot easily visually communicate, and something that those who rarely use transit might not even appreciate the value of. But it plays so much more of an important role for transit than what type of vehicle you're on. I would love to see more transit content approach improving transit as a question of how to make the service better, and only after answering that question, ask what infrastructure would work best to support that service. Jarrett Walker, a well-known transit planner, often uses a metaphor derived from a quote by philosopher Alan Watts, and says that transit technology is a wrapper and the service is the food inside. And I think this is really useful for understanding transit. You can spend most of your money to make a wrapper large and flashy, and if you have a lot of food, then certainly a larger wrapper makes sense. However, if your food tastes incredibly bad, then no matter how much you spend on making the wrapper large and flashy, nobody will eat the food inside. In many US cities like Cleveland and especially St. Louis, our main problem isn't that our wrappers are too small, but that the food inside is almost inedible. So, why not focus on the food first? There were a lot of additional points that I wanted to cover in this video, but this video was already getting too long. One of those points was regarding common misunderstandings about the removal of streetcars and why I don't believe that caused the decline in transit, but was merely a symptom. If you want to know more, City Beautiful and TransitCon have great videos that are linked below. I also strongly recommend watching Jarrett Walker's presentation for the Congress for the New Urbanism. It challenges a lot of common beliefs about transit that I previously held. I would also recommend reading the book Better Buses, Better Cities by Stephen Higashide, which provides a lot of good success stories and lessons for advocating for better public transit in the United States. Anyways, thank you so much for watching.